Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. I just switched to English so that everybody understands us, and I'm very delighted tonight, really, to have Professor Fraud with us. First of all, because she's a friend, I'm very delighted that she's back, and she honored us with her presence, and also because we are very excited to listen to her and the results of her research. She doesn't need any presentation, but just a few words for those who might not know her. Elizabeth Fraud is Associate Professor of Egyptology in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. She is born in New Zealand, but she received her first degrees from the University of Auckland and a doctorate from Oxford. She writes on aspects of non-royal self-representation and display, particularly for the late New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period. Elizabeth co-directs the Karnak graffiti project in collaboration with the Centre Franco-Egyptien d'Études, the temple, the Karnak. She is the author of biographical texts from Ramesses II, Egypt, which came out in 2007, and of articles on topics ranging from potters to religion. And tonight, she's gonna bring us really in the midst of what she's interested on. So she will be presenting us with some selected example, trying to give context of how ancient Egyptian conceptualized statue bodies, their surfaces, and animate selves of statues. So thank you again for being here, and I give the mic to you. Let me just
Cool. That's perfect. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I want to say a particular thank you to Christian for the invitation to be with you this evening, and to Elisa for all her assistance. You made it possible for us to be here in a myriad ways, and myself and my family who are here tonight are really, really grateful for that. I don't have any hand function, so it's difficult for me to transition between slides and kind of show you details, so please bear with me. I might be a bit slow, and just kind of bear with me with managing a PowerPoint, because it can be a bit tricky. So, the opening image here shows what appears to be a quite conventional depiction of Osiris with Anubis behind him. Something you might expect as part of a temple scene or on a stela. They form a field of display framed by columns and lines of hieroglyphic text. And these arrangements are something that I will come back to later in the talk. But for now, note the shadows on the body, so the line of an arm here, the curve of a spine, and the rear sitting nicely cushioned on the base. So this is a detail of the side of a block statue. So a statue that shows the individual seated with his knees pulled up to his chest and wrapped in a garment. And here, that garment, or perhaps better, that surface, bears images and texts relating to divine worlds. And this is, just behind me here, is a three-quarter view of the same statue. It's now in Leiden, and it's one that I think Christian will know, having written about it before. And to the right is a statue dedicated in Karnak more than 500 years later, where there are comparable but even more highly elaborated scenes of deities and divine actions and interactions. Such figural iconography, or figural surface iconography, is understood to be characteristic of stone statues of the early first millennium, so the Third Intermediate period, and related to expansions in the use of images on, for example, metal statues, as well as coffins. And this is something the Egyptologist Jan Assmann has referred to as a breakthrough of representations, particularly post-Amana. And they have been beautifully treated, especially for the first millennium, by John Taylor in a 2007 study. So I'll be building on some of the things he said in that study here. But the lines of development in the Ramesses period haven't been teased out all that much, I don't think. So figural surface iconography on Ramesses stone statues includes deities and humans and ranges from isolated figures, sometimes very small, to the very large, and as well as multi-figure groups, often framed like vignettes or wall scenes, as on Hor's statue. They also relate directly or indirectly to statues of deities that can be held by the statue itself. You might be able to just see the feet here of a statue of Batar. So I've gathered about 30 or 40 of these sorts of statues, depending on your definition, and that's something we can come back to. So quite a small number. And as John Taylor notes, and I'm quoting him here, no single interpretation can account for the significance and function of all of these examples of figural decoration. That applies beautifully to this material as well. So for my talk this evening, I'd like to offer just some preliminary thoughts and reflections on earlier examples of this imaging of the body. And because I'm still finding my way with this material and some of the contexts, I would be very grateful for your thoughts, points of comparison. Anything you can think of would be fab. So this material is, part of a number of studies of statues that I've been working on as I've gradually and slowly returned to research. So this is just my plan for the talk, so a bit of a roadmap, and it's accompanied by a statue of a vizier, a man called Patar, who held office under Seti I and Ramesses II. It's about 80 centimeters high, so it's quite big, and you can see he's holding a statue of Patar to his body. This statue was found at the main southern entrance to the temple of that god in Memphis. So I'll begin with just a tiny bit on statue conventions and environments, and then I want to move on to looking at emblematic representations of deities, which is a distinct but related to the larger questions I'm examining. And you might just be able to see on Patar's shoulder some hieroglyphs there. That's a title relating him to a solar form of his king. And then after that, I'm going to move into looking at different modes of display and how they are integrated by statue creators. So from types of display like stelae and statues kind of mixing together to how different beings, humans and non-humans, are integrated onto the statue body. And I'm going to be bringing in some texts because the texts are, I think, interesting and helpful for this. So this text is inscribed on Patar's body, and it says, "May Patar make my whole body firm when raising up your perfection, my arms shouldering your person every day." So it's a wonderful instance of ekphrasis, the statue describing itself, which is something I've been very interested in. And this word for how, this can be a word for a statue body. So he's describing his own statue surface, his own bodily presence of the statue. And this word neferu can also be a word for statue as well. And the word for raising is right underneath his arm, so it's all very carefully designed. And it speaks to how statues are not imitations of the real, but rather they are the real. They are things in their own right that possess their own distinct identities and agencies. And if they have these capacities, does the inclusion of surface iconography transform that in any way? That's the question I would like to explore. So for a few years now, I've been focusing on how writing is creative of this statue self. And I've been drawing very much on the work of Zainab Bahrani, the art historian for Mesopotamia and the wider ancient Near East. Her work is amazing. And she says here in her 2003 study that image making, so statue making and portrayal through substitute images were therefore quite literally dependent upon writing presence. And we see this is so familiar to us, Egyptologists and people that are familiar with Egyptian statues and representation more broadly. So these two statues here show are statues that seem primarily vehicles for writing. So the kneeling statue, the text starts on the tablet and runs down the knees, whereas the block statue here, and I'm sorry it's not a great image, this is one of the most long-standing and traditional types, and hopefully you can see, the screen resolution is actually really amazing, that he is like bound in lines of text, it's literally wrapped in inscription. So we tend to think of block statues in particular as text bearers. The use of their surfaces to present ritual scenes and scenes of gods is, I think, a significant innovation, both for the function of statues and how they relate to the presentation of a person. And of course, for all of this, context is really crucial. I feel for surface iconography that temple environments are particularly crucial for this development, and I wonder how much they're bringing the world of the temple onto the body of the statue. So we can see here this sort of modeling of a statue environment, of a perfect temple environment. And of course, I'm in Karnak. I'm not going to be spending much time in Karnak because actually Karnak's not very relevant for the developments that I'm going to be talking about, but it's my comfort zone. It's where I work. I'm like, oh, I'm in my safe space right now. So we'll start with Karnak and then we'll move rapidly north and way out of my comfort zone, I have to say. So increasing numbers of statues and stelae are set up in outer areas of temples from the early New Kingdom on. And this description by John Mart of the Agora of Priene in Greece is a really nice description of the effect of statues. He describes this open space barred with a long line of very similar monuments, dozens and dozens of them, inscribed stone blocks, multi-block pedestals, men, women, people on horses. This public space is thronged and defined by a veritable population of statue monuments. By the late New Kingdom, places like this in Karnak, these open court areas, courtyards, were probably getting very cluttered. And there's a nice example of this competitive jostling with the way the statue edges get rubbed away, perhaps by statues kind of jostling one another for space, like elbowing one another out of the way. There are some key distinctions with John Marr's description. These are not public spaces, so the audience would be much more restricted. But of course, this idea of attention grabbing through form, through having something different, having something new, is possibly part of what's going on with the statues that I'm going to talk about later in this talk. Tombs, of course, take these questions of audience, context, and statue meaning in a different direction. And I will touch on that a little later. It's possibly significant that by the 19th dynasty, tombs are very much modeled on temples, and that may be related to the developments and changes. So now I'm going to start to ease my way north, and just for an example of how we think about the social world surrounding statue creation is this wonderful image of the delivery of a statue from a tomb context. And you can see all these people like pouring water and dragging the statue, the people that would know that you've had a wonderful statue made. And then there's this scene from a Theban tomb which shows a vizier Pazer again, receiving a statue of the king. So I know it's a royal statue, but it's still, he's in the statue workshop receiving the statue. And what's interesting is he says to the sculptors that this statue is made just like that of ancient times. So this modeling on ancient pasts and this use of ancient pasts is something that is celebrated. And again, the context of the workshop, the context of dedication, these are all significant social worlds. People would be aware of this. It's hard for us to imagine what it might be to dedicate a statue of yourself, or any monument for that matter. Our digital worlds of self-fashioning can be thought of as analogous if we try to imagine. But of course, there's no physicality. But material presence is what is really crucial here. Discourses of enhancement, aspiration, and influence are valid, though. Think of your influencers and how some statues might get particularly known as being particularly fabulous, and you want your statue to have this effect. The early 19th dynasty and the statues that I'm going to be showing you are perhaps not very radical seeming, especially when you compare with the statue production of someone like Hatshepsut's high official Senenmut. But they show possibilities for what and how the body can be used as a site for display and representation. And this is just a nice example of someone that brings lots of things together. So he's a statue type where he's holding a naos, so he's holding a statue of the god in a shrine, and it mobilizes the statue's agency as a participant in temple ritual. But in this form, God and individual remain distinct, and crucially, the god is not depicted directly, but rather in the form of a statue. What I love about the statue is that you can see arrangements of text running down the body, so emphasizing the shape of the body, and this text is on the scale of temple hieroglyphs. His back pillar extends out onto the sides of his body, so the whole of his body becomes part of the back pillar. It's really cool. And on his head, he has a baboon. Both sides of his head, he has a baboon on the wig, really quite distinctive. And on his shoulder, he has a little seated figure of Osiris. So the key point here is the proliferation of divine images in relation to the body and how characteristic this is of Ramesses statuary, and also how much this statue resonates with the wider temple environment, speaks to that environment. So this is part of several interrelated strategies or modes of display that the creators of statues are deploying. And this brings me to what I promise will be a brief kind of second part of this lecture on emblems and bodies. So the figure on Yu's shoulder relates to established conventions. You're probably all very familiar with how statues can have cartouches of the king on their upper areas on the shoulders of the statues. It's very often how we date statues. And it is, to quote Richard Parkinson, a graphic declaration of loyalty, your allegiance to the king, and also to be able to bear the king's name is probably a mark of status. This image on the slide sort of reverses the convention, so it takes what is conventional on 3 dimensions and puts it in a 2-dimensional context. So it's kind of making a reverse play with the sorts of things I'm talking about in this lecture. This is early 18th dynasty, by the way. So from the late 18th and early 19th dynasty, small divine figures are increasingly attested with or instead of cartouches on these upper areas. So this is a statue in your collection here, of course, with Ahmosa Nefertari on the shoulder and Hathor on the rear of the shoulder, beautifully colored as well, really vivid, really vibrant. And the other 2 examples are from Saqqara. This one is a shabti with a little figure of Osiris between the hands. What this one does in particular is show the transfer across scales and functions. So you have necklaces with images of deities on statues, but here no suspension chain is visible. The closest parallel are 3rd intermediate period coffins, where the space between the lappets of the wig includes small divine images. So this is an amulet, perhaps, but also a marker of identification with the god. So he is Osiris in a very real capacity, and the image manifests that. And then this is my favorite, Pagerger, with Temple of Patar written across his chest and arms 4 times, domain of Patar. And this marks his body as a locus of place. So these are distinct zones, the shoulders, the upper torso, and around the neck. And also you can see like writing, which goes onto the kilt, that you have these areas where it's appropriate to write and to have images. And of course, all of this is a way of marking allegiance and association. It's all very familiar to us. Think of your rock band t-shirts or tattoos. And of course, tattooed bodies we have from Deir el-Medina, thanks to Cedric Gobet and Anne Austen's work. And this is taken from their article about this tattooed woman. So her tattoos are highly visible, again, on the throat and on the shoulders as these salient zones of the body. They're amuletic, but they also manifest her divine potential and power, what she brings forth as a healer or wise woman in the village of Deir el-Medina. And John Taylor analyzes the potential of sort of floating amuletic images as something like a conduit to the divine, a way of accessing the divine world, going out and bringing it in as well, which I think is quite useful. And we do have some exceptional examples where you have the throat being a site for display or the back of the hand, so skin surfaces. And this is really neat because it has the word mut right on her throat, which is part of an offering to the goddess here, but it's also part of the woman's name. She is an ancestor bust in her son's tomb, so the mut on the throat is making all sorts of references and has all sorts of meanings in this context. Whereas here you have these emblematic hieroglyphs on the backs of the hand on a very early 18th dynasty block statue. So although decorum and convention dictates appropriate places for text and images on statue surfaces, we shouldn't be too literal in thinking that this is how this works, that you've got some sort of skin versus clothing versus wigs. It's all surface, and it's the potential for elaboration through that surface that I think is really crucial. Wigs are also really fun for this, so you have a little standing figure, like these figures on this guy's wig from a statue in Bologna, and this now destroyed statue in Liverpool that has standing figures on the sides of the head. I find the gesture here really, really interesting and thought-provoking, and that it sort of is both an adoring gesture and a welcoming gesture, looking out perhaps to the wider setting of these statues, and like the individual himself, participating and paying honor to a wider divine presence, perhaps. But it's making a direct contact with a deity. And we have supreme realizations of all of this with first millennium magical statues, of course. This is what we think of as the sort of ultimate realization for this type of iconography. This is a significant change in conventions, of course, but there's still real limits to how far you can put signs or images on the body. There are areas of avoidance. And Campbell Price has analyzed the wig area, the treatment of the wig area, really nicely, as because our eyes are drawn to faces, you look at the face of a statue first, and having the wig bearing this inscription along the lines of braiding would be quite striking and a way of kind of attention grabbing again. So with this, I want to move into more extensive fields of display on and around statues. And this will take me into different but interrelated directions. And these are illustrated by the 2 images on this slide. The first is a stela. You can see here with, is this a statue? Is this a stela? It's some weird mixing of the two with the hands on the face. Very, very odd looking thing. And then we've got this wonderful statue from your collection here again in Turin, where the stela, a stela here of a man honoring his mother, perhaps, is embedded into the knees of the statue. It's leaning against his knees, but it's also part of the statue body in a very direct way. And the fact that it shows an offering to a family member is significant for connections I'm going to try to make going forward. These examples also show how modes of display are integrated. They show us how typologies and distinctions that we create, statue, stela, can dissolve. And this can be done in all sorts of ways. Really fun example is this guy here, who is taking this very traditional mode of a statue holding a stela and wrapping that stela all around his body. So the sun hymns that fill the surface here are bound around his body in distinct zones of text. He's like a four-sided stela with a head popping out. But you can see his hands here, raised in adoration, and a little scene tucked under his chin of him adoring Re Herakte. And there's little seated figures of him on the side as well. So, and there's even an appeal to the living on the rare surface. So I feel like an object like this encourages you to walk around it, encourages the viewer to go around the whole object. And maybe the appeal is part of that. So this possible integration, or this absolute integration of modes is done in all these sort of complex and interesting ways. Almost all of the statues we've looked at so far are of men, single men. And such statues can incorporate family members, including women, in the texts. Visually, on the architectural surfaces, the back pillar, the sides of the seat, and this is a millennia-old tradition. So these are just some nice examples where you've got the woman tucked under in the negative space under the arm, loads of people, rows and rows of people on the sides of the seat. And my new favorite example of this that we saw in the airport as we landed last night is this statue in your collection with a daughter depicted here between the two seated figures, and my son, who was running backwards and forwards with the suitcase underneath this poster. So all sorts of ways that we can display our family relationships and what matters to us in terms of our connections and our social worlds. Pair statues like this are relatively common in tomb contexts, but pretty rare from temples. And what we see happening in interesting ways in the Ramesses period is how to bring these relationships onto statue bodies into temple environments. And some quite wacky examples are these ones that show the possibilities and how people are exploring ways of doing this in temple environments. So this guy, Nefertiti-Hotep, has 4 women on the sides of his body, uninscribed, so we don't know their names, we don't know who they are, but very interesting kind of transformation of the potential of the body to have these additions on the side, compared with the monumental temple Shabti on this side. So I'm probably being a bit tangential here because I just like these examples and I think they're really fun. They're pretty extreme examples of experimentation, but they do show the expansions and the developments and how people are kind of exploring possibilities for how to bring different beings onto the statue surface. More conventional, okay. These are positively decorous by comparison with what we've just seen. But they are odd because it's unusual to have group block statues, and to have women as well. So woman here and a little seated woman there as well. And this one is particularly conventional in some ways because it has a scene of one of the men adoring Osiris on the back pillar. So a very conventional place for the incorporation of iconography. This one is a little weirder because on the front of the knees of the legs of the man is a little seated baboon flanked by figures of Osiris. It's quite almost emblematic iconography, an emblematic composition relating very much to the next world and mortuary aspirations. And it looks to me a little like coffin iconography, but I haven't been able to find an exact parallel. I'd love some parallels. That would be wonderful if anyone has any. And what you have on the sides of the body are figures of the sons coming in with their hands raised in adoration. Remember the figures of the gods on the wigs, the same gesture. So I wonder if the whole marks a divinized status for Unanefer and for his wife, Taweret Nefret. And these statues mark my transition to looking at the surface iconography of the divine. So many of the rest of the statues that I'll show you now are integrating both figural decoration of the divine, but also figural decoration of people as well, of humans. This statue in black and white, right behind me, is really big. It's over life size. Really, really big statue. And this guy is very well known. He is a general and high steward for at least 50 years in the reign of Ramesses II. The statue is almost certainly from Memphis, and Nico's starring suggests that it was one of a pair set up in Yupa's tomb. I have to confess, I originally thought it was a temple statue, and I'm coming around to Nico's position. I can see why he argues for it, and it's something we could talk about. But what it is a very good example of the elaboration of the forward projection of the kilt as a field for display. So you have Patar and Sekhmet with Thoth and Nechmetawi. So there's Patar, Sekhmet here, and then Thoth here with Nechmetawi behind. And the offering formula on the back are addressed to Osiris, Horus, and Isis, and more conventional mortuary aspirations on the back. The panels have a formality that may relate to the organization on temple walls, associations of groups, and this may be meaningful depending where the statue was set up, but it's also personally meaningful. Yupa dedicated at least one, possibly two, as Johannes knows, statues at the Temple of Thoth in Hermopolis. So this forward projection of the kilt seems to be creating personal religious topographies. What's fun about it is that it's really deeply carved in sunk relief. You can imagine it catching light in the open courts of a tomb or of a temple. That picture just slightly shows it better, maybe. And this style of carving with very low or no internal detail, like that on the statue next to him, even weirder statue next to him, is also attested on stelae. And in those cases, there are traces of yellow paint. So these figures might literally be saturated with sunlight. The statue next to him is also really fun because it takes the seated figures of gods, as they are so often shown on the pectorals around the necks of statues, and this is actually around Yupa's neck, this pectoral with three seated gods, and scales it up to the front of the statue. So we have this example of kind of the mixing of modes and the scaling up and scaling down of forms of representation. And the implications of scaling is something I'm really interested in. So if we're trying to reimagine how a statue like Yupa or even Pentaweret might have been set up in a tomb, we have these wonderful archival photographs of pair statues in the now lost 19th dynasty tomb of Kai. I've stolen this from a wonderful article by Stefan Pascali. And you can see, I hope you can see the kind of the paired figures of the tomb owner here, and how they relate to adoring figures on the pillars and what would have been on the walls of the tomb as well. And for Yupa's statue, if he was one of two set up in a forecourt like this, a tomb forecourt, he maybe would have caught the light, either from an open court, from sunlight, or from the flickering of torches as people made their way in. Very eye-catching, potentially. I think for most of the statues that I've gathered so far that have images on the body where you have the statue owner adoring gods, I suspect most of these actually come from tomb contexts. And they fit very well into the sort of environment we've just imagined. So you have in these spaces multiplicities of images of the tomb owner adoring the gods, and you have that transferred onto the statue body that was maybe put in a niche in these tomb environments or set up some way in the tomb. I know that there's a lot of experts of Memphite tombs in the audience, so I'd love your thoughts on this, because I am way, way out of my comfort zone now. I feel like I'm talking about contexts I actually have very little understanding of properly. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to get some help with this. This guy's a little different. He's tiny. He's only 11 centimeters, and he's made of this material that is maybe recycled from material that was available around. And he might have been, he's handheld perhaps. He might have been more mobile. So I'm not sure what to make of him. So what about temples? What about when you have this sort of iconography within temple environments? And now I'm stepping a little bit into places that I'm more happy with. I feel like I know my way around, except maybe not so much this temple. This is a photograph across the ruins of the Temple of Batar at Memphis. And this is a reconstruction of the temple environment by Jean-Claude Gauvin. And one of the statues I will talk about comes from here, and the others probably from the space in here, although we have no exact provenance. Condensing organizations of deities, like on Yupa's big statue, have close comparanda on contemporary stelae. So these examples come from the hypostyle hall of the Temple of Patar. And we might be tempted to think again that statue composers are taking the potentials of this sort of iconography and adapting it to the surfaces of statues. And then once they've done this, the statues can take this iconography into inner areas of temples. And this guy is a really good example of someone that is doing exactly that. So I'm sorry these photographs aren't great, but he again is using the forward projection of the kilt, even with the kilt lines around, to have an image of, it might be easier to see in the photograph, of Amun and Khonsu with a little figure of Mut presenting the goddess Mart. And this is the one that comes from that little temple complex outside the main enclosure wall. So rather than having gods facing one another, it's a dynamic, transformational scene. And often, when you have these sorts of scenes, it's a goddess performing. And I don't know quite what to make of that, but it seems significant. There's such a clear pattern. Bringing this field of ritual action into he is bringing this field of ritual action into an area because he's actually a doorstop. One of a group that we know from the Ramesses period. This is him here, and this is some of the others from Vincent Rondeau's wonderful article on these. And he would have had this forward projection at the back here, or this backward projection, I should say, that would go under a door of a naos, under the wooden doors of a naos or shrine, to keep them open or to hold them closed. So he's bringing that performance, that ritual event, into the world of the sanctuary. And he is the bearer of that. He is embodying and making that performance manifest, however we understand what that means. And I wonder how the possibility to integrate divine figures and scenes onto the body of the statue then changes the potential of that body. And this relates back to work that John Taylor has done with coffins. So for coffins, John Taylor suggests that the display of images of deities and divine emblems situates the coffin occupant among the gods, a notion fundamentally similar to that which underlies the depiction of divine figures on statues. And he sees that the religious functions of coffins and statues converge. And I want to explore these implications with just a couple of examples from the temple of Patar. So this one, he's not as visually complex as some, but he's one I've been working on for a while, and I wanted to share it with you because it's quite an interesting statue. So rather than being contained within a naos or held as a statue, you have this figure of Patar inscribed on the front of the knees. And it's this almost emblematic image is scaled up compared to the statue body, intensified by the seated pose, which means he can be at a much larger scale than if he were standing. He asserts an overwhelming protective force. And this plays out in the text, where it says, "Do not move my statue from its place." He's talking about his whole statue. "It is entrusted to Patar." And then there's some statement of reciprocity. So this entrusting of the statue to Patar puts the statue in a position to look after those that care for it. It's quite an extraordinary articulation of the statue as a nexus point for human and divine interaction. It's very unusual in formulating this so explicitly, and I think the image plays into that kind of protective quality, but also that potential for interaction and relating to a wider human audience in a temple. And finally, we get back to this guy, this beautifully carved basalt statue of Tamosa and his son, possibly a statue of both, because they have this interesting shared inscription at the back where they share the offering formula on the back pillar. To the right of the statue of Batar here, there is a statement concerning the protection of his body. So it reminds us a bit of that statue of Pazer. So it may be that this statue of Batar here is being invoked to protect the whole statue body. And look at the people around the base of the statue, painted red, still with traces of red. So you have a whole world, the fabric of this universe embodied by the statue, the gods above, the figures of his group, his kin group below. And what's really cool is that he has two pictures. Tamosa is here, and here, and here, alongside being his son as well, I think. So it's a tripling of representation, a multiplicity of the self on one statue. And of course, we're used to this from tombs, we're used to this from stelae, but it's been adapted and transformed on the statue body. And you get such a nice sense of hierarchy here too. And this hierarchy is maintained on third intermediate period statues that have a similar organization. I think it's a very distinctive integration of text and image, human and divine, pointing to different pasts and futures. On the right side of the body, framing these gods that I started the lecture with, you have ancient biographical phraseology. Going back to the 3rd millennium BCE, I came from my town, I descended from my district, I give bread to the one without, clothes to the naked. I desire the district of the necropolis, the sacred land which is hidden to him, which conceals the bodies of the favored ones. Some of this language is not used in the Ramesses period, so you don't get people using this, came from my town, descending from district, giving bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked. Very, very rare as biographical phraseology in the Ramesses period. So although biographies are the most individualizing of private monumental texts, what you have here is the least individual, the most generalizing, and the most ancient. It surrounds these divine figures, so it runs here and down here and then under, so it reads all the way around the divine figures. But it doesn't really relate directly to them, but it does speak to the images of his people on the base. And this is the group that the statements refer to. He's referring to these people that he's looking after and who will be in the necropolis with him, ideally. And then on the left side, you have a similar wrapping. You have a dedication formula by his son, Yu, running down here, And then underneath you have this appeal to the living again. And there it's not clear who's speaking. I think it's you, but I think it's deliberately ambiguous. He, who, says, O high priests of Patar, who are in the domain of Patar, Setem priests of walls, guard against saying, we will remove my statue from seeing the Lord of eternity. So you have the partial inclusion of another person's speech to open up audiences and perspectives, and the statue has very high aspirations for that audience. There's no offer of protection like we had with the Benevento statue, but that might be made manifest and be immanent in the images. They're more integrated on the body than the kind of panel texts on the front of kilts, and it may embody this relationship, this relatedness between divine and human. And I wonder if the divine figures are particularly meaningful because he is an ancestor. And I wonder if it's a way of sacralizing the body, like you have with this sacralized ancestor bust also from the Temple of Patar, that where you have processions of deities and this mobilization of this divine world on the statue body, on the head here even, because we're dealing with ancestors, and a statue that has all the kind of ancestral ways of connecting with your ancestors and mobilizing the ancestor cult through this statue in this temple. This final example takes us further in time and how these sorts of images on the body become more conventionalized, if we can ever see them as being conventional. So here you have from Karnak, so I'm back in my happy place with Karnak, a figure in the panels, on a panel on the front of the knees with a figure of Mart libating to Batar and Hathor behind. What's fun about this statue is the very large figures of a woman on the side. The same woman on both sides. It's Hat Meret Mut, his sister of his father. It's interesting that she is there with the sister. I think she probably relates less to the scene and more to himself and the wider temple world around him, that her prominence is to do with relating to that and being part of that performance in the temple. Understanding her relationship to him is also interesting. Is she his wife? And that might be very appropriate for Valentine's Day. But as the work of Leda Olabarria in particular cautions us, we have to be a bit careful about seeing the relationships we expect and want. So she might be a wife, but she might equally have contributed to the donation of the statue because she is his half-sister. So I'll take the heart away, sorry. And on the front, just down here, we have donation texts where he says, made by. So two of them claiming his own creation or his donation of the statue. But its location is interesting, and I wonder if it could also mean performed by and relate to the scene. I might be taking things too far. A final text, and one is resonant with the themes of this lecture. And this is the Pazer that I began with, a very broken schist statue of him in the Temple of Patar. This quote, this quote comes from the right of the plinth where Patar stood, and it's all about the transformation of Patar's body through wrapping and anointing. He asks for food offerings, rejoicing in sustenance, voice offerings after interment, and then receiving pure garments provided with bands and clothing imbued with the god's body. I don't think it's literally this or this. So I don't think we're literally talking about robing with gods. And by the way, this is a Valentine's image because this is Professor John Baines' wife, Jennifer Baines. modeling that t-shirt. So for those of you that know John, you will know Jennifer as well. So this is my absolute Valentine's image in this lecture, quintessential Valentine's image. So the line about receiving pure garments may refer to the reuse of temple linens, clothing imbued with the god's body, cloth that has been wrapped around and imbued with divine presence that then gets wrapped around statues. So the cloth that is wrapped around the cult statue that then statues can receive and have wrapped around them. So it alludes to the possibility for these statues to bear the gods, to evoke the body surface as a site of representation and as a locus for the divine. I did have a closing slide, but actually I think this one works very well because it's quite fun, and and Jennifer gets to be with me in my lecture, but because it integrates all of these ideas about what it means to have the divine and other humans on your body. So if we think about what it is to be a self, our selves are made up of multiple people. We are worlds of relationship. And these statues mobilize those worlds explicitly by integrating humans and divine on the body. And I wonder if these statues that have divine figures on them do something even more than that. That if you were pouring water on them or touching them, whether you would access the divine and be that conduit for the divine in a more direct way. I'm not sure, and that's where I would like your thoughts. I feel like this development is really quite significant for statue bodies. I feel like it's quite meaningful, but I'm still wondering if I'm pushing interpretation too far or whether there are other ways of seeing this. Is it really just about getting your attention and in a new way? And maybe it is, and maybe that's enough, but maybe there's a bit more to it than that. And I would love your thoughts. So I will stop and thank you very much for your attention. This is so you can meet the boy in the photograph.
Well, thank you so much for your amazing lecture. Well, you did got our attention, and it's really interesting the way you try to analyze how the representation of the divine puts the statue all together in another sphere, as it were, and we have to try to understand what it does with it and what role it can play. We need a temple or the tomb. And I loved you quoted a couple of times the parallelism with John Taylor and what he did with Coffins, where when he talks about the coffins becoming a cosmogram, and so transcending even the shape, and then, he demonstrated in different times, in quite convincing way, how the lid is the place of Nut, how the case is the place where you have the canopic deities and where you have a transformation, and it does become a cosmogram, and it
just articulated that so much more clearly than I did. Thank you.
No, but now I'm trying to go, how could he, because I never thought, so I thank you so much for opening up our eyes tonight of how the statue itself can be transformative, how itself could do things, and I think it opens up so much interpretation that we have to carefully study and to see what it can do with it. And I also liked when you showed, because something I'm working on, when you showed how there is our coming back, reverse interpretation that sometimes the B-dimensional can becoming three-dimensional.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we see with a very nice parallelism between, for instance, carousel coffin and burial chamber, where we say the carousel coffin imitates burial chamber, but it can be reversed as well. And so, and I think we shouldn't, I mean, what you taught us tonight, actually, that we shouldn't be fixed in our typology in considering material as being diverse. As you said, if it works in temples and if it works in coffins, maybe we should open up our eyes and see also what it does with statues. So well.
That's a really good point, actually, and I think we're categories to help us kind of organize the material for our own analysis, but then it blinkers us a bit from seeing the potentials, and then maybe that opens up a way of theorizing the implications of this that we haven't got to yet. I certainly haven't got to yet, but that's the tomb.
Relations, and also the temple grammar and how the temple itself works as a space, and how the statue could work within that space, and how the representation is not just a symbolic representation, but it's transformative in itself, in the status and role that the statue can be within that temple grammar, that performance. Or
I really started out thinking that most of these statues were I hoped most of them were temple statues, and that they were just they were bringing the temple iconography onto their bodies and sort of making themselves sort of temple, embodying the temple in this way. But it's not that straightforward, and there's all these other interplays going on with the tomb and with coffins, and I think John Taylor articulates this really beautifully in his study.
He does,
So I'm just really following him.
Well, which is a good step to start from. So, are there questions, comments? I can give the word to. Yes.
Thank you, Liz. I'm sorry I had a gap in your talk. I needed to leave, but
I saw that you had to leave.
It was just amazing and so thought-provocative. I was just wondering, with such a rich textual program and images on the statues, could any of the images be secondary editions, or could there have been interventions after the statue was conceived in a different way?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we do know of statues where in the third intermediate period they're taking Middle Kingdom statues and 18th dynasty statues and adding images onto the body, especially these floating figural representations, as part of their transformation of and appropriation of an older statue. I wonder about the statue that I showed that had the three-seated gods on the front that related to the necklace form. I really worry about that statue because it's really weird looking, and I wonder if that's an example of that. And you'd need to look and see if, I guess, the kilt has been cut down in any way, or I don't know how you'd have to examine it to see if there are possibilities for that. So I worry about that a bit with that statue. With most of the others, because especially like Tamosa and Yuyu's statue, it's so integrated with the text, and the text is so much about them, and we know who they are. Then I think it's there. That's a safe one, and I think all of the ones where you have the text and the text of the person and a known person integrating with the scene, I think we can be confident. But there are ones in the corpus that I've gathered so far where I'm not so sure, and I think we'd have to find ways of assessing that question. But it is a really good question, and I think the fact that you've got third intermediate period people adding images of gods onto older statues as part of making that statue theirs, it tells you something about the significance of those images, that they're sort of necessary for the appropriate sacralization of the body. And that speaks to the importance of this type of iconography, even if I can't articulate yet just what is going on with it. Sorry, long answer, sorry.
Any other questions? Johannes.
My mind is still processing all the amazing details and thoughts you presented. But I have a very stupid, maybe, question, because I read their pure garments and clothing. Do any other statues talk about being clothed, or is there any evidence for statues originally having any kind of textile? Because I'm thinking of late period bronzes and other things that are deposited, wrapped in textile, whether this is a part also of, adding an additional significance to a statue in a temple context.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it relates to sort of Christina Riggs's work on the wrapping of bodies and statues. And I don't know of parallels for this phraseology here, except maybe Campbell Price would know, maybe from the late period statues that he works on, you might get something like this. It's not familiar to me from the Ramesses corpus that I work on, so it seems quite distinctive. But you do get, there's a statue that I can think of that was found at al-Kab at Abydos, and it's a big stone falcon statue dedicated by Yuyu, the guy with the baboons on his wig. And it was wrapped in cloth, and the excavators, it was deposited, wrapped in linen. So I think it's possible. I don't think statues that were set up in forecourts of temples were wrapped in linen, or at least not for any length of time. They might have received linen offerings as part of the circulation of offerings. But I don't think they were wrapped up. I think what this refers to is the possibility to, as a body, and the desire to bear that type of material as the biological body, but it also relates to the statues that might be imbued with this divine presence. So if a corpse can be bound and transfigured by the wrapping of temple linens, then the statues might evoke that potential by having the images on them. But I really like playing these two verses against this material, but it's hard to push it too far because I don't know of many parallels. So.
Any other questions? Yes, Paolo. Well, I can bring it myself. See who is the first one.
And the winner is... No, thank you, Liz, for this fantastic, amazing lecture. I was just triggered by your lecture and thinking about other examples of divine images on bodies. And so I was thinking of different contexts. Well, one is from New Kingdom anyway, and is the best tattoos of best images on the thighs of girls. So there you have both a bidimensional representation of a girl that is dancing or not with the tattoos, and then you find the same kind of best representation on thighs on the the girl figures on wooden spoons, cosmetic spoons.
Yeah.
So it's, again, taken from reality and then put on an object, on a bidimensional representation, and also on an object that is representing a girl. And then I was thinking also of the different chronology, Middle Kingdom wooden statues, where the divine images are inside the joints of the shoulders.
Oh, cool! I didn't know about that.
This was studied by Marie van der Busch. Was studying this. I don't know if she completed the study or.
Oh, wow!
But anyway, I know that she was studying that. So there you have the wooden statue. Of course, it's a funerary context, but the divine image is not meant to be visible, but it's there.
That's so cool. There's a late period Ptolemaic spell in the Book of the Dead that the rubric of the spell says that you have to have particular divine images on the shoulder and on the chest. And I wonder if, having them in the joints is part of that magical transformation of the statue body. But I'll have to find out a bit more about that. That's remarkable, and it just shows, that these ideas about what statues can do, they're elaborating on ancient concepts and things that have been done to statues for hundreds of years, and that image of Patar receiving the statue that was made at just like ancient times kind of speaks to this desire to kind of reach back into deep time and use all of these ideas that have been circulating. But that's wonderful. And the best example is really cool too, and it relates to the tattoos. And the tattoos that were on the throat of the wise woman, and then you have the mut on the throat of the ancestor bust, and you wonder just how much these statues are relating to things that are happening to the biological body, but they're also transforming the meaning of that body, and they are not those bodies. So all sorts of things going on there. I'd love to know more about the wooden statues, Paolo. Thank you. So cool. I think Imran he's either nudging me to stop talking or.
Yes. So I think that we can. Well, thank you again for your really amazing lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you will have to come back soon to keep provoking us and giving us new way to look at the material.
And showing you pictures of John's.
Yes, exactly, on Valentine's Day. Thank you again, and thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming.